Sherry Thomas is Kerala born and Philadelphia raised. She completed her BA in International Relations from the University of Pennsylvania and her JD from Temple University. She is passionate about issues of social and economic justice and currently combines both in her career as a public interest lawyer. She focuses her work on tenants' rights, defense, and eviction prevention from the Legal Clinic for the Disabled as its Director of Housing and Habitability, and also has worked as a legal fellow and legal consultant for International Justice Mission, a global organization partnering with local justice systems to end violence against people living in poverty. Sherry grew up in the Martoma Church in a tightly knit Malayali community in Philadelphia. She was always interested in the ways the church would be instrumental in bridging gaps between cultures and generations. Her experience informed her work with the South Asian American Digital Archive, SADA. Through SADA, she preserved some stories of Malayali Christians living and working in Philadelphia over several generations, which culminated in the publication of her project, The Philadelphia Malayali Story, Decades in the Making. Let's welcome Sherry Thomas.
So you've probably heard the phrase, don't miss the forest for the trees. This popular saying means to avoid getting so caught up in the details that you miss the bigger picture. I want you to remember this phrase as I walk through this presentation. It applies to the individual stories of the Philadelphia Malayali community that I'll be sharing, but it also applies to the story of the U.S. through its history of deciding who gets to come here, who we keep out, and the whys behind those decisions through looking at court decisions and legislation. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to collect the stories of South Asian Christians in the Philadelphia area, specifically the stories of the Malayali community. This was made possible with a fellowship with SADA, which is the South Asian American Digital Archive. When I first saw the description of the project and who they were looking for to do this type of project, I texted my sister the link, and I said to her, oh, this looks kind of interesting and cool, what do you think? And she read through it, and she wrote back to me, and she said, I think they're looking for you. And they were, so I was encouraged, and SADA was specifically looking for a fellow with ties to the community here. I came here, I was born in Kerala, India. I came here in 1987 with my parents. I grew up in Philadelphia. I attended all Philadelphia public schools, completed all of my higher education in Philadelphia. I've seen the immigrant landscape change, specifically here in Northeast Philadelphia, which is where this church sits, over the last 37 years. The house that I live in now is actually walking distance from the house that I arrived to in 1987. I've moved here because my aunt had come here as a nurse in the 1970s. She became a citizen and then sponsored our family. So we moved into that house just nearby. It was her, my uncle, another uncle, 3 children, 3 of their children, and then my parents and I. And that's where we started. I've spent a lifetime at the intersection of Indian, American, and Christian, grappling with the idea of belonging. Belonging in multiple places at once or not belonging neatly into any one given space. This grappling is not a unique experience to me, as I see a lot of nodding heads. I think I've found my target audience here. So over several months, I interviewed 8 individuals, 7 of them agreed to be published. And all of these people immigrated to Philadelphia between 1966 and the early 2000s. I chose at least one person from each decade. There's a few decades that have multiple. Across diverse professions, nurses, entrepreneurs, corporate leaders, IT professionals. So I could see whether there were any similarities or differences in their experience, depending on when they got here and why they decided to immigrate. We talked about everything, how they grew up, where they were from in India, their reasons to come here, what their expectations were, if they had any ideas of America before they got here. And all of the dreams and visions and hopes that they had for themselves and their families. So they talked with me through all of those experiences And they also shared a lot about the role of their faith and that the church played in their journeys. At first glance, this might look like just like 7 separate stories, although they had overlapping themes. So they told stories of racial tension, cultural shock, assimilation, and incredible resilience. But as I was going through the stories, something else really interesting came up. Although I knew each of them through my home church, the Marthoma Church of Philadelphia, I didn't tell any of them who else I was interviewing, and I didn't share with them the questions that were overlapping in their interviews. In other words, none of them were talking to each other about anything. But each person connected to the next without even trying. So their stories showed a natural progression through the decades of the Malayali Christian experience in Philadelphia, building block after building block. And they even appeared in each other's stories without knowing. So for example, the first person I interviewed, Dr. Anna Panikol, she arrived in 1966, shortly after the US opened immigration to people based on skills and not necessarily race. And I'll be talking about that more in detail as we go forward. She came to pursue her PhD in chemistry at Temple University. I then interviewed Mr. Thomas Verghese, who came to Philadelphia in 1975. So he came a full 9 years after Dr. Panikol. And one thing he stated was that he never thought that he would come to America because that was for, quote unquote, more qualified people than him. You see, he had spent years seeing photos of the people that were immigrating to the US in newspapers in Kerala, but they were always doctors or engineers or scientists like Dr. Panikol. Thomas Verghese then shared with me that he built his life in America along with his late wife, Shoshama, who came here and made a career as a nurse at Temple Hospital in the 1970s. Temple Hospital is where another person I interviewed, Sushila Majoy, where she worked for most of her life after she arrived in 1976. Thomas Verghese also talked about finding a job in a garment factory and bringing newly arrived Indians to work with him in that factory when they were searching for work. Later, I interviewed Juby George, who immigrated to the US like I did as a child, as a 7-year-old, with his father and sister. When he was sharing memories of his late father, he mentioned that before his father opened an Indian grocery store, he worked in a factory. When I asked how he got that job, Juby believed that it was through friends and words of mouth, just the way that Thomas Verghese had said. Juby's dad owned and operated an Indian grocery store in North Philadelphia in the 1980s. 2 full decades after Dr. Panikol lived in North Philadelphia, and she shared with me that not having an Indian grocery store was really tough, really hard to enjoy a meal that reminded her of home. So Juby told me about his Indian carryout business, which was inspired in part by his father's entrepreneurial spirit, and it's located in Flourtown, which is right outside of Philadelphia. Coincidentally, Thomas Verghese also became an entrepreneur, opening his first convenience store, and that first convenience store was also in Flourtown. I interviewed John Phillip, who arrived to the US in 1980. He talked about getting into computers, something he had never even set eyes on growing up in a poor village in Kerala. He attended the Computer Learning Center, otherwise known as CLC, and that's a training center focused on adult education in computer technology. CLC helped propel him into Cigna, where he climbed the corporate ladder. Coincidentally, another one of my interviewees, MG Thomas, also shared how CLC helped him change careers from a job at Cardone, which was a factory that employed many Indians that came to the Philadelphia area, to SEPTA, where he eventually worked as an electrical and electronics maintainer. By the time my last interviewee, Binu Matthew, arrived from Kerala in the early 2000s, she was already trained as a software engineer and arrived after she got married to her husband, who came to the US on an employment-based visa during the tech boom. So even though these stories are their own, their journeys intertwined and built on each other. Despite coming in different decades and pursuing different livelihoods, they shared values of community, education, and being part of a faith community. Each of these people found their ways to the Philadelphia area in many, many different ways, leaving familiarity, and taking great risks. And I asked all of them, if you had a chance to move back to India, would you do it? And the answer was a resounding no. Some of them said that they had considered a lot in the beginning when things were really, really hard. But after a while, they said they wouldn't go back because they've built a life here. In other words, they found a place of belonging right here, and most of them not far from where you're sitting today. But South Asians didn't always belong in the United States, and for the most part, that belonging or lack thereof was a direct result of the laws of the land. So I mentioned earlier to not miss the forest for the trees. So similar to how individual stories I collected build on each other, the law operates in the same way. So when the US Supreme Court makes a decision, it's a big deal. And the reason is because whatever decisions are made in the Supreme Court then will bind every single court below it. It becomes the law of the land. So then other courts have to use the same guidance for all similar cases. So one singular decision is not really a singular decision at all, as it hurts, or sorry, that was a Freudian slip. One singular decision is not really a singular decision at all, as it has the ability to transform the landscape for an entire nation or entire groups of people. And South Asian Christians are no exception. In the story of America, we arrived long after the story of America began. And so before we came, there was a system of values that didn't necessarily include us, and none of us landed here through pure happenstance. So before delving in too deep, I have a few disclaimers. One, and we've heard this all throughout this conference, the role of South Asians in American history, this history is still being documented and collected, and there are places like SADA that are working to do that. There's this conference, right? So we are in the midst of live collection, right, of these stories. So that's one thing. So there are going to be gaps, probably, of some knowledge and things that just aren't recorded yet. Okay. The other thing I wanted to go over is I will be sharing audio clips from these interviews throughout this talk. But and they're going to be, 30 seconds to 2 minutes. But these interviews were much longer than that. So if you want a fuller picture of the context, I really encourage you to go and take a look. So one of the clearest signs of belonging in a country is by way of legal status, right? Are you undocumented? Are you a temporary visa holder? Legal permanent resident, otherwise known as a green card holder, or are you a U.S. citizen? And do you get to become a U.S. citizen because you were born here, either through birthright citizenship, or do you get to be a U.S. citizen because you go through the legal process and you become naturalized? So who gets status? Ephesians 2 uses the word citizen in reference to a Christian status or place in God's family. Verse 19 says, "So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God." What this verse shows me is that citizenship is very powerful. It comes with benefits and privileges, and it signals a belonging to a group and a commitment to an identity. Arguably, the most coveted status in a country is that of being a citizen. I discussed citizenship with one of my interviewees, M.G. Thomas. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1985 to Philadelphia via Houston, where he had worked at a gas station. After moving to Philadelphia, I mentioned earlier, he worked at Cardone. He married his wife, who is an Indian nurse, you're seeing all these common threads, and raised his family. And here's what he had to say about becoming an American citizen.
Honestly, I came in 1985, and most of the people that came here in 1980s, they took their American citizenship after 5 years. I did not take my American citizenship because I felt that my identity was losing when I take the citizenship of other country. So I waited till 1999, almost 20 years, 15 years, 20 years.
So once M.G. Thomas was ready to take that step to become a citizen, America was ready to embrace him at that point. But that wasn't always the case. So I'm going to tell you a story of another Indian man who had decided to become a citizen. You guys may be familiar with him. So this is Bhagat Singh Tinda. He immigrated to Seattle in 1913. He was one of many Indian men who arrived around the same time. Many of them were Punjabi Sikhs fleeing political repression and civil unrest from British-occupied India. And a lot of them ended up working in lumber yards in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington and Oregon. In 1917, the US entered World War I, and Bhagat Singh, despite being an Indian citizen at the time, he was permitted to enlist and serve in the US Army. So up until that point, naturalization, so the legal process to become a citizen, not you being born here, but you came here and now you're trying to become a citizen, it was limited to only one race, and that race was white. The 1790 Naturalization Act stated that free white persons of good character could qualify for US citizenship. Later, that Naturalization Act was expanded to include Black Americans, so then it allowed white people or those of African descent to become US citizens. So it was in this environment that Bhagat Singh Thind began his quest for citizenship. So he first applied in 1917 and was denied, and then he tried again in 1918 and actually got citizenship, but then it was rescinded 4 days later because he was not considered a free white man. He tried again in Oregon. At this time, there was this idea that all human beings could be categorized into 5 races. And just Indians, okay, so one of those races was Caucasian. And Indians at that time were considered to be part of that Caucasian category. And just a few months earlier, the Supreme Court had decided that Japanese people could not be citizens because they were not Caucasian. So Bhagat Singh's argument, he thought, well, if I can make the argument that I'm Caucasian, then surely I can become a citizen. So he made this argument to a judge in Oregon who agreed with him. But the Bureau of Naturalization opposed the citizenship, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. So that's how we get to this Supreme Court decision. And the singular question in front of the Supreme Court was, are Indians white? And the court considered the term Caucasian and ultimately concluded that no, Indians are not white, and that the people who wrote the law at the time never meant to include Indian people in their writing of the law. Even though Caucasian was an anthropological or scientific term at the time, the court said, well, that's not how the regular person sees you. So that's how they made that decision. So free white persons really meant people of European descent and those who could visually be seen as white. And this is what the Supreme Court said, and I'll quote from it, but I should note that the court uses the word Hindu in their quote, but Hindu was not referring to his religion, right? That was the catch-all term that they were using for Indian people. And they said, it is a matter of familiar observation and knowledge that the physical group characteristics of the Hindus render them readily distinguishable from the various groups of persons in this country commonly recognized as white. The children of English, French, German, Italian, Scandinavian, and other European parentage quickly merge into the mass of our population, and they lose the distinctive hallmarks of their European origin. On the other hand, it cannot be doubted that the children born in this country of Hindu parents would retain indefinitely the clear evidence of their ancestry. It's very far from our thought to suggest a slightest question of racial superiority or inferiority, but what we suggest is merely racial difference, and it is of such character and extent that the great body of our people instinctively recognizes it and rejects the thought of assimilation. So this was just very explicitly said in the Supreme Court decision. And what I have next, so this was actually a newspaper article from that time, and you see that the The headline is Hindus too brunette to vote here. And one of the things I wanted to point out that it was hailed as, for the most part, with delight, right? So that's the environment that he was in. So because of this decision, like I said, because one decision then trickles down and impacts everybody, because of the decision, there were about 50 Indians in America that had already obtained citizenship, and all of their citizenships were revoked. And they became stateless, because in order to become a citizen of one country, you give up the other one, right? So they became stateless, and so when you talk about citizenship having the highest privileges, being stateless on the opposite end, you have nothing. It gives the least, right? You have difficulty accessing services, you have vulnerability to exploitation and discrimination. One of the Indian Americans that lost his citizenship was Vaishno Das Bagai. He lived in San Francisco with his family, and when he lost citizenship, he had to liquidate his business and couldn't get a US passport to visit India. Depressed, he eventually did take his own life. And he left behind a note that said, "I came to America thinking, dreaming, and hoping to make this land my home. I established myself and tried to give my children the best American education. But now they come to me and say, I'm no longer an American citizen. Now what am I? What have I made of myself and my children? I do not choose to live the life of an interned person. Yes, I am in a free country and can move about where and when I wish inside this country, but is life worth living in a gilded cage? Obstacles this way, blockades that way, and the bridges burnt behind." So this next slide highlights the timeline, right? So Bhagat saying that decision happened in 1923. Indians cannot be US citizens. The Johnson-Reed Act, which was the Immigration Act of 1924, this one was very, very restrictive based on race. There was a complete ban on Asian immigrants at that point, and there were racial quotas, except for people coming from the Western Hemisphere. And then the racial quotas for everyone else was dependent on how many of your people were already in the country. And I'm not a mathematician, but 100% of zero is still zero, right? So there was this interest in keeping things status quo. There was also this uprise of a lot of anti-miscegenation laws, which is basically bans on interracial marriage, right? And it all came out of the greater context of what was happening in America at that time. There was a significant movement building based in eugenics. And eugenics is the study of how to control a population's desired traits through reproduction. So in this case, the desired trait was to be white, and eugenics was used to justify white supremacy. And this was what was eventually adopted by the Nazis to justify their marginalization of and extermination of people. So this was like the environment, right? And this is what it stayed at for about 4 decades. And America was cutting itself off to non-white influences and really in this like very protection and preservation mode. But then a massive change came in the mid-1960s. So the 1965 Act really opened up, it blasted open the doors for people like us to immigrate here. The Civil Rights Act also passed at the same time, or a year before rather. And there was opposition, of course, on both ends. And I wanted to highlight one quote from somebody he was a senator who voted against the Civil Rights Act, and this is relevant to our talk here today about identity. He said, "Those who wish to denounce me as a bigot may do so, but I, for one, want this nation to remain Christian and civilized in the Western European and American sense of the word." So there was still a sentiment, even at that time, right, as we think about who's Christian, who's Indian, there's not a full acceptance at that point. But it did blast open the doors for South Asians to come. And the biggest contrast was that, so in 1924, the act basically banned all Asian countries. And in 1965, it removed all the quotas, right? So you could come here based on your skill, or you could come here based on family reunification. So if you had parents, spouse, siblings, right? And there was an actual ranking where we were all like written into this law. And it was just 1 year following this speech that the first person that I interviewed, Dr. Anna Panikkal, came to Philadelphia. So I'd like to spend this next section highlighting some of the voices of the Malayali immigrants to Philadelphia and explore briefly some of these themes and insights that I gained from them. The reason I want to do this is because when laws are made, interpreted, and enforced, you have to remember that there are always going to be real people that experience the impact of those laws. So as I said, Anna Panikkal moved to Philadelphia as a young single woman to pursue her PhD. She came alone. She lived in North Philadelphia. At the time, there wasn't really a sizable South Asian Christian community yet. So she shared through her oral history the loneliness that she felt, the defeat, the depression of going at things alone. Eventually, she got married and was joined by her husband, and they began searching for a home, and they purchased one that's actually also just walking distance from where you're sitting right now. But the process of purchasing a home and moving into a new neighborhood highlighted to her that just because the law had changed, hearts had not. Let's listen as she shares her experience and also that of her uncle who had lived in North Carolina at the time.
Kind of was a little shocked, that, I told you, we were a little afraid also when they started throwing things. I told you something, they used to come and throw apple or something. The kids, I think, the neighborhood, they were this Jewish, not all of them are like that, but we felt unwelcome. Oh yeah. In fact, this real estate agent took us to show a house in mainland. He went and showed us a very dilapidated, house, because he knew they wouldn't accept us. That is very wealthy neighborhood, mainline. That I remember.
So how did you deal with it?
Well, we used to sit and talk, maybe because of our skin, they don't like us. Things like that. Other than that, we couldn't do much about it. We will sit and, my husband and I, yeah. And later on, when we had the little Malayalam community, we kind of felt more at home because we had company, we can talk. So then you don't think much, and they started moving, and that didn't become a big issue, really. And when Anil and Libby, they were in Greenberg, one day, one kid, tore his coat or something, Anil, because he's a colored kid, according to him. And I remember my husband had to go, the teacher, to talk and all. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that incident I remember. Mm-hmm. But Greenberg has more Malayali kids. They started bussing and all later, Even, I think when they were in school, they start bussing. Or that, of course, that kind of, racial discrimination was there. Those were the days when, this lynching and all the southern states treating blacks. This is all before the civil liberty thing and all, Martin Luther King. It is much before. When my uncle was in North Carolina, he had to sit in the back of the bus. He was not allowed to sit in the front. They bought a house in Charlotte, North Carolina. When they first bought the house, the neighbors, went and gave an appeal to the municipal court or something. These black people are moving in and all that. Finally, because they found that he's a professor, the wife is a doctor, they kind of settled down. They did petition that these people are moving in and they don't want them in our community.
Despite feeling unwelcome, Dr. Panikkal and many of her generation moved forward with great resilience. And building a life meant gritting your teeth and sometimes doing things that you didn't really expect to do, including setting aside preference in favor of practicality when it came to what kind of work you would take. Let's listen to Thomas Verghese. He arrived in 1975 from Bhopal, India, where he had been working a white-collar office clerk job. Here, he is sharing what it was like for him in the job search when he first moved to Philadelphia.
I tried to get some job in the office or somewhere. That time it was hard because nobody recognizes us. They don't know what kind of people, Indians. So I go to work in the factory, garment factory I work.
How did you find that job?
That is another thing. The morning we take some change and go to the SEPTA and we walk. We go to all over in the city outside, because it's go up to Erie Avenue. We get down, we walk, we look, there is a factory. We go there and ask them, hey, do you have any opening here? Then the first some people see us, hey, no opening.
Why do you think they said that?
That is because we are the newcomers here, right? Especially, I don't know why Indians, we are the first time we go there, because they want the reference. If you want to keep somebody there, they want to look at reference. Somebody say, hey, I know this guy. And they don't know how Indians work hard. So finally, then they find out us working, or they only take Indians. Any Indians come, they come on. So that kind of thing.
So did you recommend other people?
Oh, lot of people. That time whoever coming, because they tell us, we want a job. Okay, come on, we take. Not only me, everybody work. They come, how many they know, everybody. The beginning I work almost 2 years I work. We were pressing. They were making jacket. It's a coat factory, So we have to press that with the steam. And this time you think about that 96 degrees outside. So how much of the steam you think that? But we were working there. That's a funny thing, The people from here, they never stay. They run away from there. They say, no.
Along with pushing forward, another theme that emerged from these histories was the comfort and support that emerged from Christian fellowship, particularly in the Indian church in Philadelphia. Even though this talk is titled The Legal Boundaries of Belonging, the law can only take you so far. What the law does is it sets out an ideal and a framework, right? It emphasizes what people should do, but it's really up to the people to really uphold and exercise what that is. So just because the US decided to no longer exclude South Asians from legally belonging to the country, it didn't mean that the people who came here actually felt included. When I hear the word belonging, I think of a place where I feel supported, wanted, cared for. And obtaining legal status was in many ways just the beginning of belonging for South Asian Christians in America. We got the permission to have the freedom to embrace our culture, to live here, build lives here, and set down roots. All of my interviewees came from the church that I grew up in, the Philadelphia Marthoma Church, and each person spoke fondly of the role that the church played in their settlement. Interestingly, it seemed like maintaining that Malayali Christian culture without completely assimilating actually gave people the strength to carry through and then actually belong better in the space that they were in. Because of the relatively small numbers of Malayali Christians who moved to the area immediately after 65, the early church was an ecumenical one, and it was consisted of people from several denominations. A group met in spaces all over Philadelphia, in University City, and they would meet for worship and have meals together afterwards. They were led by worship by priests who came, including people who came to study at Princeton Theological Seminary, were coming and being part of that community as well. And it wasn't until 1976 that the church I grew up in, Marthama Church, was established. And this is the church in which everyone that I interviewed worshiped. So this is John Phillip. He came to Philadelphia in 1980, and he made his career in corporate America. He spoke extensively to me about the role of the church in creating belonging. So right before this clip, he spoke about the different roles the church played in the Indian Christian community, including that of meeting cultural, spiritual, and social needs. Let's hear from him.
Because if you look at the needs of a human being, am I right? If you look at the needs of to being they need to be belong to something. They need to have a value system. They need to have a culture where they feel they are valued, they are important, their norms and their language is understood, their way of communication is understood, and they feel like somebody care about them, somebody value them, somebody not putting you down, or the other places in the community. In a lot of people, I don't think I ever had that, but a lot of people, they didn't feel that satisfaction in the workplace and other place because they were not part of that original community or the culture, or they were not always talking about Phillies and Eagles and everything. You need to be part of, if you are part of this place, you have to know about Phillies, you know, talk about Eagles, you have to talk about the players, you have to talk about yesterday's game. And many of us, they didn't have that ability to merge with that because it was not natural to them.
You know, it's an interesting thing. I remember growing up in the Indian church and feeling like the church just wasn't getting it right because we were a homogenous church by race. And to me, what that reflected was an exclusion of other people, and that it was running really in conflict and antithetical to the scripture. But over time, I found that viewpoint is really overly simplistic. And my interviews showed that. So for people in a foreign land, we are actually a minority within a minority. And those churches were key places where our community's faith was actually sharpened. That is where people really put their faith into action. There was a desperate dependency on God, a desperate dependency on each other, and a deep understanding that prayer and authentic fellowship was actually essential to survival and later flourishing in our communities. So earlier in the presentation, I shared about an Indian man who, in order to have a chance at keeping his US citizenship, had to argue that he was actually white. And he had to separate himself from his cultural identity to find belonging in this country. And for a very long time, that's what was required. How amazing is it that we can be here today at a conference which celebrates and explores histories and futures of South Asian Christians in America? It wasn't that long ago that America made the Indian identity synonymous with being Hindu and made the Christian identity synonymous with being white. In fact, it was so recent that Bhagat Singh Thind, who I shared about earlier, he was still alive when Dr. Anna Panikal came here to America. He died in 1967. So I started this talk with the saying, don't miss the forest for the trees, and I urge you to look at the bigger picture. Whenever we read the Bible, we're told to read it in its entirety, right? So we can understand the character of God, his heart for his children, and the things that he values. The law is the same in so many ways. On any given day, there's legislation being written and passed and implemented all across this country, some of which may not impact you at all. But it is worth it to examine the overall messages that are being sent through what's being put forward. What gets passed, what doesn't, how the court rules on certain things, are often a reflection of what a society values at any given time, for better or for worse. How recent in time these cases and legislation were reminds me of how fragile this belonging is. It's far too easy to belong one day and not belong the next. It's far too easy for whole groups of people to be demonized and for people with power to wield it over those with very little power. So we as Indian Christians, we landed here in America kind of in the middle of the story, right? So we benefited greatly from other people who really fought for our belonging in this country, whether that was our family and friends that sponsored us to come over here, or whether that was policymakers or judges that we will never meet, right? But their decisions and legacies impact us even to this day. And South Asian Christians, specifically in America, have achieved a lot, right? Where generally speaking, I did hear Sam George's talk earlier about the outliers, but generally speaking, we have achieved great success and stability. And so my question, about our future is, as we think about it, let's ask ourselves the question, like, why were we brought here? And what do we do with what we have? And what is it that God requires of us to do in order to bring people into belonging?
Thank you so much, Sherry, for that awesome presentation. It's now time for some Q&A.